But one general observation may be in order at the outset. Arendt's focal argument is that the effect of Augustine's teaching is to withdraw the human subject from the public and political sphere. Love, as he understands it, is worldless, to use her terminology, and functions as an alternative to the agon of political labor, the construction of actual communities of law and human nurture. She's, of course, writing in the middle of a cultural crisis about the moral possibility of politics, the Germany of the 1920s, and Augustine has become for her the symbol of a beautiful soul diversion from the political imperative. But a less constrained reading would be able to show how Augustine is arguing, in effect, that the very notion of the public and the political depends on a Christian anthropology, in the sense that only a rectified love, delivered from crippling self-referentiality, can prevent us from spinning apart into unmanageable rivalry. Augustine is constantly beginning his analysis not simply from a generalized conviction about original sin, but from a highly specific diagnosis of how self-defense, self-deceit, and self-aggrandizement combine to poison interrelation in human affairs. Augustine, far from dissolving solidarity in favor of a community held together by the implicitly violent imperative of holding a single faith, is seeking to identify the way in which sin solidarity is, paradoxically, what dissolves any actual human communality, so that grace becomes the means of releasing the possibility of concrete and truthful social existence. The themes we're going to look at here should all be thought through in the light of this fundamental point. The first of these is to do with Augustine's account in the Confessions of his own early experience of love, and more particularly of loss. In Confessions, Book 4, chapters 4 through 9, Augustine describes what he went through when an intimate friend of his teenage years died, having been baptized in his last illness. This account is the earliest we have in Western literature of the complex processes of bereavement, anger, self-doubt, and survivor's guilt, the pain of seeing familiar, once shared sights now organized around an absence, wanting to be dead, fearing death, and so on. A pivotal moment in this account is the poignant and pregnant phrase in Book 4, Chapter 7, "What mindlessness it is not to know how to love human beings humanly, humanitaire. And what a foolish human I was then, so impatient in coping with the human condition." What he portrays is thus in some way an inhuman love. By investing his very identity in the relation with his friend, Augustine has involved himself in a deeply ambiguous mode of subjectivity, in which the absence of the loved one, what is there to be loved, is the emotion of grief itself. The actual and independent reality of my mortal friend is swallowed up in an absorption with my state of mind and heart, including my memories and images of what I've lost. My love is incapable of letting the loved one be free of my subjectivity, even though death is the most dramatic possible reminder that what I love is not under my control. The logic is that to love humanly would be to love in the awareness that the one I love exists in a context other than my needs or projects. Extreme grief of the kind Augustine describes, with its detachment from the reality of the object of love, implies that I have made the other carry too much in my imagination. Dealing with grief of this sort is learning to return to the fact of shared mortality, to the humana, the human affairs or human condition from which Augustine sees himself as shrinking. This is not an attitude indifferent to the specificity of the object of love, seeing such an object as simply a reminder to love God, There's indeed a sense of solidarity in the human mortal condition. And we have to keep a watchful eye on our friendships and loves if we're to avoid using such relationships to assure ourselves that we're not really mortal. In Book 4, Chapter 8, Augustine memorably evokes the joys of friendship, including the joys shared in what we would call body language, the expressive communication of eyes and faces as well as speech, only to insist that this is in itself potentially an escape from a starker reality, so that if interrupted by a death, we feel we've lost ourselves as well as the one we love. Loving humanly, it seems, must be a love that refuses to ignore the mortality and limitedness of what or whom we love. Forget this, and we're left with an intensity of felt intimacy that ultimately and subtly refuses to release the person loved from the bonds of that intimacy. And to love the friend as mortal is to love him or her in God, that is, to love them as they relate to God. This will sound like a form of Arendt's indirect relatedness, unless we recall that for Augustine, any attempt to love or indeed to know anything except as related to God is illusory. Augustine is not, I believe, trying to persuade us that loving my neighbor is a mere instantiation of my love of God. But we shall find a similar reading with some similar critical questions in the work of Martin Nussbaum. In the wake of a characteristically sensitive and imaginative summary of Augustine's teaching, fully recognizing that he renounces the wish to depart from our human condition, she identifies three major problems which she believes Augustine leaves worryingly unresolved, and significantly, Arendt is cited several times in this discussion. The issues are first the question of whether Augustine's scheme really allows for the love of individuals. Second, whether it has any place for human reciprocity, for genuinely mutual engagement with the neighbor. And third, whether the motivation for compassion in Augustine is the same as that which Nussbaum argues we need for a contemporary ethic, a genuine care for the material and social suffering of others. Nussbaum suggests that it is not the same, that Augustine's compassion is stirred by the fact of human solidarity in sin and error, not by each earthly instance of injustice and wrongful death. Her general conclusion is that Augustine is at best ambivalent about the love of individuals, that he does not provide any satisfactory notion of shared moral agency as a basis for the common political life, and that his stress on obedience is the heart of all the ethical integrity and virtue, combined with an insistent otherworldly direction for human longing, produces a soporific self, passive and compliant in the face of specific worldly injustices. Despite Nussbaum's interpretation of what Augustine means by love, life, and the way in which he counters the idea that we should be ashamed of need or imperfection, he still reintroduces shame in a manner that has deeply dangerous consequence for a viable public ethic. Unfallen humanity was beyond longing and striving, and restored humanity looks to that as an ideal. Thus, the erotic, in the most general sense, is something tied to our fallen condition, a shameful loss of control. We universally fail in obedience and so need to be directed from above. The politics of Eden is this: to be ashamed of your longing for objects, your curiosity to know them, and your very wish to originate independent actions. Be so ashamed that you see this as radical evil and yield your will before the authority of the church. This is a strong indictment, even stronger than Jean Ron's, Some of its points, especially about Augustine's alleged indifference to compassion or specific earthly suffering in the neighbor, can be met with reference to the texts about the relief of the neighbor's material need, which have already been cited. And Augustine's warnings about the risks of investing in the wrong kind of intensity in human friendships are warnings less about particular affections as such than about an ultimately depersonalizing and instrumentalizing attitude to others that makes ordinary human friendship impossible. No one could read Augustine in extenso and conclude that he allowed no place for the love of individuals. But the underlying point is to do with the nature of human solidarity, and both Nussbaum and Arendt agree in seeing Augustine's understanding of this as fundamentally to do with solidarity in sin and helplessness, so that intelligent and purposive action in solidarity is of little or no interest in an Augustinian world. What this leaves out of account, however, is that Augustine takes it for granted that the positive solidarity of mutual care and nourishment is built into the created order in a variety of ways, and that the ultimate destiny of human beings is communion with the Trinitarian God through the medium of the fellowship of believers. As so often in these discussions, we have to be careful not to ignore the entire theological context of what Augustine says about our nature and goal, and that's also why it is potentially misleading to say that Augustine subordinates individual will to the authority of the Church. As the foregoing chapters will have indicated, Augustine believes that our fundamental problem is not that we're too active and need to be discouraged from originating independent actions. It's that sin makes us incapable of real action. If we allow our desire and delight to be fixed upon finite goods, we cease to long for truth or life itself. Without the critique of finite desire advanced by Augustine, we allow ourselves to be too easily satisfied and so become aneurotic, close in on what we understand to be our well-being. By binding our desire to finite objects, specific and temporal goods, we confine or reduce our humanity and allow these finite goods to define us, so that we end up reacting rather than acting, shaping our desires and projects to the limits of what is achievable. He means what's already achievable or believed to be achievable. When we're released into the full desire of God's goodness, we are more, not less active. Nussbaum's complaint that Augustine seeks to silence the independent will holds only if we ignore Augustine's basic conviction that the one thing we do not have in our own right or resource is an independent will. The fallen will is dependent in all the wrong ways, formed by the pressure of objects without and passions within, by the pressures of honor and public expectation, by the unpredictable world of apparently arbitrary craving. The work of grace is to make us dependent in the right way, dissatisfied with anything less than the horizon of God's own selflessness and seeking to remain open to that selfless agency as it transforms our relation with the world and each other.